Hi, and welcome to Scruffy Tales. First off, I want to apologize for my poor microphone, but a new one is on the shopping list. I promise. My channel is still in its early beginning, so while the videos won't be the most advanced, I hope my content will still be interesting. Now, with that out of the way, what I am about to tell you is a piece of forgotten history, a story of brave men and courage that is not taught in schools or in history classes. It is an exceptional story of exceptional men who took part in an extraordinary mission, going up against extraordinary odds. And I hope you will stay with me to the end of this video. And above all, I hope you will retell this story to people around you, because these men have been forgotten for too long, and their achievements have been forgotten for too long. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve that you remember them. The 60s is perhaps most remembered for the Vietnam War, when people think about wars and conflicts from that era. But there was one more large conflict taking place in the 60s, a war that could have kicked off World War III. It was the Congo Crisis, a brutal war that officially took place between 1960 and 1964 in the Central African nation of the Congo. It was a war that was influenced by the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as China. A war that saw the United Nations send its troops on aggressive campaigns with infantry, armor, and air power to fight rebels. It was a war over immense wealth and even the raw materials to create nuclear weapons. By 1959, the Congo provided 9% of the world's copper, 49% of its cobalt, and 69% of the world's industrial diamonds. And a majority of the uranium to produce the bombs that fell over Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II came from the Congo. The history behind this war, and indeed the war itself, truly deserves a more in-depth video. This was a conflict fought at the height of the Cold War, and the United Nations truly feared that it could spark World War III if it wasn't handled correctly. But as interesting as this is, in this video we will focus on a small operation taking place towards the end of the hostilities. An operation that involved several Swedish soldiers who showed immense courage and bravery when under fire, and two of them especially would prove themselves to be exceptional among Swedish soldiers in the modern era, even to this day. Towards the end of 1963, the already torn African countries saw a new faction emerge in the deep jungle among the many tribes and villages of the Congo. The Mulele Uprising of the Kwilu province spread quickly, terrorizing the already war-torn countryside. But this was not a disorganized mob. This was a skillfully led operation. The leader of this new faction was Pierre Mulele, previously the Minister of Education in the Congo government. Pierre Mulele had returned to his home country after having spent time in China, committing to the communist cause and learning how to organize a communist revolution and how to wage a guerrilla war to overthrow the government and defeat the regular army. For 6 months, Pierre Mulele recruited and trained over 10,000 communist partisans from his own tribe and its villages. When Mulele was ready, he unleashed a storm of destruction and death across the Kwilu province, targeting those loyal to the government, as well as schools, hospitals, and churches, burning everything to the ground and slaughtering anyone not loyal to Mulele. What made Mulele's force even more terrifying was that Mulele had managed to ally himself with several witch doctors, practitioners of dark magic, who made magical potions for their warriors, potions made from human testicles. This was not only a communist revolution, this was also a cannibal horde. Cannibalism was a real problem in Congo at the time, and cannibals caused all sorts of trouble for the UN and its peacekeepers, making it even dangerous to handle the flood of refugees fleeing from the various war zones. Cannibals and witch doctors were part of the population. They were refugees like everyone else, but they would commit murder when given the chance, and they would eat the flesh of their victims. UN soldiers on patrol always ran the risk of being attacked by cannibal war parties, and the UN personnel in charge of refugee camps had to police the refugees to keep the cannibals among them in check. And now, this violent practice had been weaponized by Mulele.
The Mulele partisans thought they were immortal, drinking from the potions of the witch doctors. Those who would die later on were simply ignored as not having been true believers, and they were better off dead. Without fear of death, thanks to their dark magic, high on drugs so they felt no pain, and fueled by a hatred provided by the corrupted teachings of Marx, the Mulele partisans swept across the Kwilu province, bringing death, fire, and a hunger for human flesh. They spread their corrupt ideology as they burned down their own country and murdered their own countrymen. As news of the Mulele uprising spread, several Western countries demanded that action was taken. Many foreign citizens had been murdered by this new and dangerous rebellion, and several more were still left in the Kwilu province. But by this time, the UN was slowly leaving the Congo and had few troops left available, which was part of the reason why Mulele had seen his opportunity to strike. But something had to be done. Several missionary churches dotted the landscape of the Kwilu province, and it was clear what the outcome would be if the partisans reached them first. The UN saw no other option than to put together a special task force that would go into the jungle and rescue the missionaries, and fight the partisans if necessary. The man put in charge of the operation was a Canadian Brigadier General, J.A. Dextras, along with the French-Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Paul Meyer. The operation was named after the Brigadier General, receiving the operational designation Jadex 1. They planned to rely on helicopters to quickly go to each missionary station and bring back all the nuns and priests to the forward operations base at Chikapa, but they had little time to organize it all. Above all, they needed soldiers that could be trusted if things went wrong, since only so few could fit in each helicopter. In short, they had to handpick the best soldiers around, the smartest, the fastest, and those who would not hesitate to open fire. Soldiers from 6 nations were gathered in short order, equipped with 6 helicopters of the H-19 Chickasaw class and 2 de Havilland Otter planes as scouts. The team under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Meyer included the Swedish captain Stig von Beyer. He had spent his youth in the Congo and knew the land, the culture, and the language. Stig von Beyer was no ordinary officer, but a central figure of the UN operations taking place during the Congo crisis. A trusted negotiator between factions, outspoken and argumentative, a more than capable officer, and a proven combat tactician when under fire, one of the most competent soldiers on location in the Congo at the time. The team also included his friend, the Swedish Lieutenant Torvald Glans, a skilled fighter pilot that was given one of the scout planes. Glans had earned a reputation and was known as both Bomber Glans and the Mad Swede. On the 24th of January 1964, the helicopters and airplanes of Jadex 1 left Chicapa for the first time and headed out into the Kwilu province. They flew past burning villages with thick pillars of black smoke rising from the fields and jungles, evidence of the Mulele warriors' onslaught. Their first missions were successful and thankfully uneventful, but it would not last. On the 27th of January, they headed for the Catholic mission at Candela. They had already rescued American missionaries from a station around 10 kilometers from Candela, and the two helicopters of Lieutenant Colonel Meyer's team were already crowded. Glantz was flying overhead in his scout plane as Meyer ordered his Norwegian pilot, Peter Carlsen, to go in low. Stig von Beyer and the lieutenant colonel could see that two nuns were held against their will inside of the mission. Meyer ordered Carlsen to land. As the helicopter landed, from across a field a large group of partisans emerged and charged the helicopter. The soldiers opened fire from both helicopters. From above, Glantz took his plane into a dive and flew in low over the field in an attempt to slow down the partisans' charge, dropping hand grenades from his cockpit. Glantz used tubes that held several grenades each, with pins pulled, and held them out of his cockpit window, and simply poured the grenades onto the enemies below as they flew past over their heads at high speed. The nuns came running out of the building and hurried over to the helicopter while the gunfight was raging. The UN soldiers fired at the partisans, who launched arrows and spears at them and even fired old muskets. Even Glantz and his plane took hits as he flew in low over the field. The nuns climbed inside, and Lieutenant Carlsen struggled to get the overcrowded helicopter off the ground. As the two helicopters left the station behind, Stig von Beyer could see two priests still held captive by the celebrating partisans, almost as if the Mulele warriors taunted the UN soldiers with the priests. The rescue mission had failed. Back at Chicapa, the rescued missionaries were taken care of, but not without begging the UN troops to go back and help the priests that had been left behind. The UN soldiers thought about their options. They knew there were 2 priests left at Candela. They knew that going back would almost certainly be suicide, and the 2 priests were most likely already dead by now. But they could not abandon them. No one in the team could, and von Beyer pushed for another rescue attempt. Lieutenant Colonel Meyer approved of going back and granted von Beyer permission to refuel the helicopters and fill them up with all the ammunition and grenades they could carry. The plan was that Meyer's helicopter would stay in the air and act as fire support. Von Beyer and his helicopter would land and rescue the priests. Von Beyer's helicopter was piloted by the Swedish pilot Bo Lehmann. They would fly in low over the treetops to avoid detection for as long as possible, then land and storm the hostiles, rescue the priests, and then make their escape. Von Beyer had 2 soldiers with him in his helicopter, a Nigerian soldier, plus Sergeant Leonce Lessard from Canada. The 2 helicopters took off, together with Glantz and his airplane, and headed back towards Candela. As planned, von Beyer's helicopter swooped in low over the trees once they got closer to the station. They could see the 2 priests naked and tied up to poles in the middle of a field, surrounded by several dozens of partisans, possibly several hundreds. The helicopter went in for a landing, but was immediately showered by arrows and spears as well as musket fire. The helicopter had no choice but to take off and gain altitude, and at the same time von Beyer and the other 2 opened fire at the partisans. Out of harm's way, high in the air, the 2 helicopters circled the area, and they could clearly see the 2 priests naked and tied up, down in the middle of the field, surrounded by Mulele's warriors. Lieutenant Colonel Meyer ordered another assault. Meyer's helicopter took point, closely followed by von Beyer's helicopter. Meyer and his men opened fire with their weapons as they swept in over the partisans that crowded the field and dropped grenades down onto them. Shortly afterwards, von Beyer's helicopter, with Lehmann holding the controls, came crashing in and landed hard. Lieutenant von Beyer and Sergeant Lessard, together with the Nigerian soldier, jumped out of their helicopter and threw grenades all around them and emptied their weapons to clear a path. Meyer's helicopter circled overhead and provided fire support. The helicopter and soldiers on the ground were surrounded and being attacked by waves of hundreds of hostile Mulele warriors, all high on drugs and the magic potions, believing they were immortal. Von Beyer fired his submachine gun, seeing bullets hitting flesh, but the enemy just came running at them. Without support from the air, they would be slaughtered in seconds. The 2 priests somehow managed to get loose from the poles they had been tied to and came running, naked as they were, towards the helicopter on the ground. Von Beyer and his 2 comrades did what they could to cover the 2 priests, but it seemed like there was no end to the enemy warriors. When one enemy fell dead, it seemed as if 3 more took his place. Lieutenant Glantz, in his scout plane, did his part and lived up to his reputation. Glance flew in low towards the hostile Mulele warriors, low enough to touch their heads, and dropped hand grenades from the window of his cockpit, repeating these low-flying dive bombings time and time again, emptying several tubes that had been filled with hand grenades. And once he no longer had any grenades left, he still flew in low, using his plane as a weapon when he landed on top of large groups of enemies, bouncing along the field before returning to the skies. Arrows and spears came flying in towards von Bayer and his men, together with salvos of muskets. One arrow bounced off von Bayer's submachine gun, and another pierced his boot. The Nigerian soldier took one arrow to the arm. It did not prevent the hardened UN veterans from returning fire. Von Bayer and his men grabbed the priests and without any niceties threw them into the helicopter. With everyone in the helicopter, Lehmann tried to take off, but the helicopter was stuck, a landing wheel having slipped into a hole in the ground. The helicopter couldn't take off. Running out of ammunition and with no more grenades, von Bayer was left with only his sidearm, firing his pistol from the helicopter, thinking that he had to save the last bullet for himself. There was simply no way they could prevent the inevitable against a horde of Mulele warriors slowly closing in around them. And all around, hundreds of hostiles were closing in, trying to reach the helicopter, trying to get past the gunfire and grenades being dropped from the second helicopter above, trying to get past the sweeping attacks of Glant's aircraft. But then Lehmann managed to get the helicopter off the ground, and they all took to the skies, leaving the deadly horde behind them. They had made their escape only moments from being overrun. Back at Chicapa, the team met up with General Dextras. The general was concerned to say the least. The Mulele warriors were fearless and numerous, and it had required a huge amount of ammunition to save the nuns and priests from the Candela outpost, almost resulting in the loss of a helicopter, its crew, and the soldiers it carried. And Glant's scout plane had been hit with 17 shots, with 2 of his fuel tanks leaking. And Lehmann's helicopter was damaged as well. Only a few days into the operation, and already 1 plane and 1 helicopter damaged. And General Dextras needed the team to plan to evacuate another 20 missionary stations. It seemed like an impossible task. It was at this moment that Lieutenant Thorvald Glantz coined the famous phrase that would become the unit's motto: "No problem, we fly again." And fly again they did. Jadex 1 would continue going out into the jungle to rescue people from the cannibal rampage, a horde that was fueled by communist extremists who were allied with menacing witch doctors. And again, they would risk their lives in order to bring the missionaries back to safety. By February 1st, Jadex 1 was still flying rescue missions. But now only 1 missionary outpost remained that required rescue: the Belgian church at Kisanji, with 8 nuns, 1 priest, and an unknown number of Congolese nuns. Jadex 1 had received reports that some 600 Mulele partisans had taken the missionary station and held the staff captive. This time, Jadex 1 had no intentions of repeating the mistakes at Candela. 5 helicopters were assigned to this one mission, carrying 3 soldiers each, and also included Glantz and his de Havilland airplane. And the mission was even provided with close air support in the form of fighters from the Congolese Air Force. These fighters were crewed by Cuban pilots, and even 2 aircraft operated by pilots working for the American CIA. As the force arrived, they saw that these partisans were a greater threat than during previous encounters. These warriors were also armed with modern rifles. Several nuns were easily spotted in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by jungle. Stig von Bayer's helicopter swooped in and landed, and Stig, together with a couple of Nigerian soldiers, jumped out and opened fire immediately. The hostiles were quick to return fire with rifles, muskets, arrows, and spears. An attack aircraft from the Congolese Air Force swept in with machine guns and fought off a wave of warriors charging Stig's helicopter. Shortly after, Sergeant Lessard's helicopter landed next to Stig's. Together, the UN soldiers fought off the attacking Mulele warriors and helped the nuns to the helicopters. All the while, the enemy was trying to reach them, while friendly aircraft, helicopters, and airplanes kept attacking from above to keep the helicopters on the ground safe. A truck filled with Mulele partisans came down the road at high speed, intent on reaching the helicopters. A Congolese fighter swept in an attempt to stop it and launched rockets at the truck, but missed. The truck, crowded with hostiles, closed in on the 2 helicopters. Torvald Glantz realized what was about to happen. The helicopters would be overwhelmed as soon as the truck and the warriors it carried reached them. Glantz called out over the radio, "I'll take it," and took his scout plane into a dive and came up behind the truck, and as he passed it overhead, dropped a grenade right into the middle of the Mulele warriors. The grenade detonated, and the truck lost control and crashed into a ditch, warriors being violently flung to the ground from the crash. Sergeant Lessard carried a wounded nun and was the last to reach the helicopters, his fellow UN soldiers providing covering fire. He threw her inside and was about to climb inside himself when 4 Mulele warriors grabbed hold of him. Lessard proceeded to hammer them with blows from his fists, while he shouted to the pilot to take off. The helicopter began to lift from the ground. Lessard managed in the last second to break free from the attackers and grabbed hold of the helicopter and climbed back inside as it was taking to the skies. Returning to base, it was clear that it had been a trap. The nuns had been bait, and the Mulele warriors had planned to attack and kill as many UN soldiers as possible. Jadex 1 had walked right into a trap and just barely avoided disaster. Pierre Mulele had trained his partisans well in guerrilla warfare, having learned in China how to exploit Western powers' weaknesses. And nuns, standing in the open in need of rescue, would attract Western troops like a moth to the flame. The next day, on the 2nd of February, the priest from Kisanji had been released and brought a message to the UN troops. The Mulele partisans wished to negotiate the release of the remaining nuns. In return, they wanted a helicopter and weapons. Von Bayer opposed the idea, arguing it was useless to talk with these people. But Meyer decided it was worth a shot. It was decided that von Bayer's helicopter would drop off Meyer, and the remaining force was to wait on standby a few kilometers away. Glans and the other scout pilot, he too a Swede by the name of Bengt Landevik, would circle overhead to keep an eye on things and call in the helicopters if needed. Von Bayer's helicopter landed at the missionary outpost and dropped off Meyer, and then took to the skies once more and circled together with the two scout planes. They had no way of knowing what was going on as the negotiations took place indoors. Minutes felt like hours. Then they saw Meyer emerge from the building, uneasy on his feet, holding his head, clearly in trouble. Von Bayer ordered the helicopter to land. Glans realized the danger and flew in low as usual, swooping in above the heads of the Mulele warriors, distracting them by so doing, and giving Meyer enough time to reach von Bayer's helicopter and climb inside. The helicopter took off, and the UN soldiers withdrew to avoid further trouble. Meyer had been struck over the head by a club during the negotiations. The blow had landed after his revolver had been taken from him, and the Mulele partisan leaders had tried to kill him with it. By sheer luck, the gun had failed to fire, and Meyer had managed to make his escape. On the 3rd of February, Jadex 1 would return one last time to Kisanji. Stig von Bayer was now in charge, with Lieutenant Colonel Meyer in sickbed after a severe blow to his head the day before. 5 helicopters and Glans and his aircraft set out to return to Kisanji and rescue the remaining nuns from the vicious cannibals, who justified their terrifying violence by hiding behind a communist revolution. Only this time, they had no close air support beyond their own helicopters and Glans and his de Havilland airplane. Again, the nuns were kept out in a clearing as bait. They were exposed and in danger, and the UN soldiers had to reach them somehow before they could be hurt. The UN troops of Jadex 1 had no choice. They went in. Captain Stig von Bayer and Sergeant Leonce Lessard went in with their 2 helicopters and landed, and instantly came under intense fire from muskets and rifles as well as arrows and spear. Von Bayer and Lessard, together with their Nigerian soldiers, jumped out and returned fire, quickly emptying their magazines. A Mulele warrior rushed up to von Bayer as he was reloading, a machete raised and ready to cleave the Swede's skull. Lieutenant Braga, the Brazilian helicopter pilot, leaned out from his cockpit with his Colt 45 and emptied his magazine into the drug-crazed warrior. Glans repeatedly took his plane into one dive run after the other, dropping grenades as the troops on the ground fought their way to the nuns. The other helicopters circled overhead, the soldiers inside firing their weapons and throwing grenades. Glans swept in low and forced the partisans to throw themselves flat on the ground, but nothing they did could stop the oncoming horde. According to some estimates, von Bayer and Lessard were surrounded by possibly as many as 1,000 Mulele warriors. It was chaos and insanity, with death and violence all around. Von Bayer and Lessard eventually got the nuns moving and covered the women as they ran for their lives to the helicopters. Stig von Bayer and his helicopter was the first to take off. As they did, the Mulele warriors focused all their efforts at Lessard and his men as they headed back to their own aircraft. The soldiers in the air emptied every magazine they had, and Glans swept in low time and time again, doing everything in their power to keep the bloodthirsty partisans away from the last remaining UN troops on the ground. Eventually, rising through a blanket of incoming arrows, the second helicopter rose to safety from the chaos below. Jadex 1 was airborne once more and could make their escape. As Stig von Bayer took a sigh of relief that they were finally out of trouble, Braga, the Brazilian helicopter pilot, looked back over his shoulder at Stig, held up his pistol and said with a smile, "Colt 45 is all you need." As the Brazilian laughed, Stig only shook his head. But they had not tricked death just yet. They didn't get far. Lizard's helicopter had been so damaged during the fighting that it no longer could fly and had to make an emergency landing. Von Bayer ordered his own helicopter around and soon after landed nearby Lizard's. Von Bayer hurried over and soon found the Norwegian pilot, Lieutenant Per Carlson, together with his Danish mechanic, Sergeant Jeppesen. Both were desperately trying to repair the engine of the helicopter. It soon became clear that the helicopter could not be saved, and everyone grabbed their weapons and took up defensive positions. It did not take long before they could hear voices shouting in the jungle, voices growing in strength as they came closer. Von Bayer gave the order to abandon the helicopter. There was no time to wait for the other helicopters to pick them up. The nuns in the damaged helicopter were rushed over to the functional one. As soon as they were all on board, von Bayer shouted at Sergeant Lizard and his men to hurry on over and abandon their positions. The UN soldiers ran for all their worth and climbed hurriedly inside. As the last boot left the ground, the Mulele warriors came charging out of the jungle. Lieutenant Braga pulled on his controls in hopes of getting the now severely overloaded helicopter off the ground. But nothing happened. The Mulele partisans attacked in force, firing muskets and rifles as well as launching arrows. The UN soldiers opened the side door and returned fire at close range, gunning down several of the hostiles. As if on cue, Braga managed to get the helicopter off the ground, bouncing along as the rotor blades struggled to get the heavy cargo into the air. Eventually, the UN helicopter managed to climb, but only just barely to stay clear of the treetops. Jadex 1 had tricked death once more, and again only just barely. The 4th of February saw the end of Operation Jadex 1, an operation that had begun on the 24th of January, and when it was over had seen the rescue of 106 missionaries, an immense success in other words. The members of Jadex 1 had risked their own lives during several daring raids and fooled death itself time and time again. It was not the end of it by far. The Mulele rebellion spread to other provinces and other factions emerged during the chaos as well. 2 more operations similar to Jadex 1 would be organized, one after the other, both with Stig von Bayer in command. Operation Strawberry and Operation Stay Put were organized back to back with orders to evacuate wounded Congolese soldiers from the front lines, as well as evacuating fleeing refugees and surrounded missionaries. And von Bayer didn't return to the dangers of the jungle without his trusted friend, Thorvald Glans. During these 2 operations, the UN troops on a daily basis ended up in firefights with the Mulele warriors. The problem was that they could no longer rely on Nigerian infantry to support their missions, since they were no longer available after taking too many wounded while joining these dangerous operations. Stig von Bayer tried to get Swedish soldiers assigned to his operations, but Swedish commanders refused to risk Swedish lives on the suicidal missions. It came down to Stig von Bayer and Leonce Lizard, together with the trusted pilot Glans and the Danish mechanic Jeppesen, at times even Brigadier General Dextras himself, to form the core of the unit. A unit that at the end of May 1964, as the last of the operations came to a conclusion, had become experts in fighting the Mulele warriors in close combat and in relying on their helicopters and airplanes to perform daring raids deep in the jungle in enemy-held territory. On the 15th of March 1964, the United Nations Secretary-General received a telegram thanking the UN troops that had taken part in these dangerous and daring operations, particularly because they had rescued a number of American citizens. The telegram did not hold back in its praise and mentioned by name 13 officers and soldiers that had participated in the 3 operations. On that list, 4 Swedes were mentioned: Captain von Beyer, Lieutenant Glantz, Warrant Officer Wahlund, and Warrant Officer Dahlgren. Of course, Dextras, Meyer, Lessard, Braga, and Jeppesen were also mentioned by name. As for who had sent the telegram to the Secretary-General, giving such high praise, none other than the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. On the 23rd of April 1964, Stig von Beyer and Thorvald Glantz both received from the Swedish Armed Forces the Vasa Medal in Gold of the 8th rank for their actions in the Kwilu province, for having shown incredible courage in the face of danger and for taking fearless actions in saving the lives of others. The sad thing is that these men are unknown. The Swedish troops who fought in the Congo crisis have received extremely little recognition in their own country. Stig von Beyer, who should be a legend, is completely unknown. Thorvald Glantz, who used his own airplane as a weapon when he had no more hand grenades left, is never mentioned in any history class. The sacrifices of the men who served in the Congo crisis has been ignored and by design forgotten. They risked their lives, some even died, on the front lines of the Cold War, fighting to not only preserve the peace in the Congo, but also to preserve world peace. The Swedish UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld died when he went to visit the Congo to negotiate a truce between the main warring factions. The Congo crisis was not a small, obscure conflict at the edge of the world. It was a conflict that could have sparked World War III. A UN Secretary-General died trying to bring a peaceful conclusion to the war, and Swedish soldiers fought and died to preserve the peace at the height of the Cold War. 6,000 Swedes served in the Congo. Many took part in hard fighting against various rebel factions and mercenary units. 19 Swedes died. 2 Swedes, who are still considered missing in action officially, were most likely eaten by cannibals after having been taken prisoner during an ambush. And no one cares. They have all been swept under the rug, all their sacrifices, all their hardships, all their courage, ignored and forgotten. And in the middle of this, a number of Swedes took part in 3 daring operations, fighting their way through dozens of dangerous missions, combating a crazy horde of communist cannibals out in the deep jungle of the Congo. And they saved hundreds of lives, and no one has heard of them. An entire nation has ignored them. Forgotten heroes, men who deserve to be remembered. Remember them. And that will have to be it for this time around. An incredible story, if you ask me, and one that truly deserves to be told and made known to as many people as possible. I hope you have found it interesting and that you will tell people about it. And with that, Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.